Hopefully you'll find it informational. What the concept behind this is to give you guys, when you're not in the studio environment, the opportunity to remind or tap into some of the lifestyle aspects of yoga. I've been practicing yoga for a long time now, about 20 years. And when I first started practicing yoga, people would ask a lot what yoga was. And I haven't been asked that in a while. It feels like nowadays everybody, whether you've done yoga or not, kind of has a concept of what a yoga class would be like or what happens in a yoga studio, when in fact it's actually pretty interesting, because what we're doing in our physical practice is really just a small sliver of this full system of yoga. And because people aren't really asking what yoga is, we don't get a lot of opportunities as teachers or as advocates for yoga to explain the power of the full system. And it's really become something that I'm incredibly passionate about, trying to advocate for the bigger picture around yoga. And so I wanted to tap into that just as a baseline today. When we go to yoga, or when we do yoga, which can happen outside of a studio, it can happen walking in the park or grocery shopping, what is actually happening? And the classical definition of yoga is this union between the physical body. Hey, you guys that are joining, the union between the physical body, the energy body, our mind, and then this deeper soul or spirit that embodies us. And I like to refer to this as a place of absolute truth. So when we come into yoga, whether that's on the yoga mat or whether it's when we wake up in the morning or before we go to bed, wherever you feel like you're finding that alignment, that is where yoga happens. And it's actually tapping into this place of absolute truth. So if you think about this, we can exist in a lot of different ways. We can exist strictly from a physical standpoint. You may feel very connected to that idea. You might know people who their physical embodiment drives a lot of what happens in their life. The physical body will say, I'm hungry or I'm tired. That's one way of existing. We can exist from our emotions. This is something I kind of struggle with, how I feel. Is that who I am? Or am I more profound than that? So if I feel sad or if I feel excited, that is not my only way of existing, but it can become that over time if we're not careful. We can exist in our mind. You know, you might know people who are very mentally in tune, and they're thinkers and overanalyzers, and there can be this whole thing happening in the mind that nobody else is experiencing, right? And eventually that will start to cause suffering. And we can exist clairvoyantly. You might know this is actually like the yoga meme now, like what are my chakras telling me, or what am I getting when I meditate? That is an existence. It's a way of experiencing the world, and some people are really in tune with their intuition and clairvoyance. However, it's just one aspect of who we are. And so what happens in true yoga is that all of these existences begin to align, and it pulls us deeper into the essence of who we are, which is a space of absolute truth. And when we can find that, and it can sometimes be fleeting, you begin to feel less chaotic, you begin to feel less conflicted, so you can be dealing with an issue in your relationship, your business, your friendships, but you will get complete clarity around the path when you're tapped into that absolute truth, right? Because it doesn't waver. It's not fluid like the emotions. It's not tricky like the mind, and it's not really black and white like the body, right? It's deeper than all of that. And so that's what we're searching for as yogis, and what we are trying to find when we come to the mat is just an experience to pull us back into the body, to start to even out the emotions, so that hopefully over time we can taste a little nectar of that absolute truth. I want to do a little exercise together. We're going to take a mudra of hooking the pinky fingers together. So you can do this sitting in your office. You're just going to hook them and let them rest on your lap, and then close your eyes and feel what's happening with those two pinky fingers coming together. This is a mudra of union. Take a moment to feel physical body, any messages that you might be receiving from the physical body. Take a moment to feel emotionally the messages that are coming up for you today. Notice the thoughts that might run through the mind. And maybe connect to intuition, wisdom. If you have a religious belief, it can also be that energy of God or an omnipresent energy that guides you. Could even be your ancestors or the people who came before you. See if you can feel all four of those at the same time. And allow yourself to expand into that. And so I have no idea where you are sitting. You could be in an office building separated by walls, and there may be lots of people around you, but can you begin to feel energetically you expand until your energy overlaps the nearest person to you, and you might have to imagine who that would be. And this is the fabric of absolute truth, where we begin to feel a connection to other people. And in yoga, we end our practices oftentimes with a namaste, which means that the goodness, the highest parts of me, the divine, the light within me honors that same ingredient or that same special sauce in the people around me. When we can tap into our own truth, we begin to realize that we are all connected, and you can almost feel that connection. So take your hands together at the heart and just take a moment to honor that essence with a little quiet namaste. So if you are not going to be able to practice today, you just got a little practice, right? You just got the opportunity to tap into what yoga is. Here's why this is important. I talked about this in class a couple weeks ago. It's become a little bit of a liberal joke on CNN, if you watch CNN, about alternative facts, right? I think it was Kellyanne Conway that coined that term. Thank you very much, Kelly, for doing that for us. And it sounds ridiculous because we're like, oh, there's only one fact, right? There were X number of people at the inauguration. That's fact, right? But the truth is that perception varies depending upon who's seeing it. So as much as I hate to give somebody that idea of alternative fact, yoga actually kind of speaks to that, right? There's relative truth, which means the situation's going to change depending on who's viewing it. And there's absolute truth where nothing ever changes. And what we're trying to tap into is that absolute space. So this becomes really important. And I actually, for a long time, kind of felt like it was a burden to be living right now with social media and the internet and the influx of news. But I've begun to really look at it as a very exciting time to be alive and to try to be a yogi. It makes it that much more difficult because we can be swayed by advertising. We can be swayed by diatribes on Facebook. There's so many different things that can impact what we think and how we view the world, right? But when we're able to tap into that space of absolute truth, none of that matters anymore. It is very difficult because we get pulled out of our body and out of our own thoughts quite often. But there is a responsibility to do that. So when we look at social issues that are relevant in the world right now, it would be easy 100 years ago to bury your head and pretend that slavery was okay, or that other things that may have been going on, oppression to women were okay, right? Now that we're educated and we understand historically the impact of that, we have this huge responsibility to step up and to change that behavior. But the first part of it is acknowledging and understanding and finding what is true. So there are these things in yoga philosophy called the Kleshas, and there's 5 of them, and there's a belief that these 5 kleshas are basically the root of all suffering. And the kleshas are ignorance, not understanding what's happening around you, and over-identification with the ego, which is really easy in our culture right now, being overly driven by desire. So everything's like a pleasure trade-off. Avoidance, which, you can be doing really good on some of them, and you're like, oh, avoidance. And then attachment or fear, which tap into shame and guilt and some of the things that exist in the shadow of our subconscious, right? And so when we can tap into absolute truth, those kleshas actually dissolve by themselves. Desire will subside. We'll quit avoiding, right? We won't be as attached. We don't view ourselves just as our ego, which can be very self-serving. And we see with clear eyes. We don't have a misperception or a story, which I also do. I'm a story person. I think we all are. We have this little story in our head about how we've been wronged in some way or misunderstood in some way. But when we tap into that true spot, all of that begins to fall away. And that place is bliss. It's just happiness, this feeling of being content. So that is yoga, right? And try explaining that to somebody at a coffee shop. He's like, oh, you teach yoga. What do you do with your life? It's fleeting. There's moments where we find yoga. In an hour class or a 75-minute class, we may not actually be doing yoga at all. We might be prepping our body to come into that space, or we might get glimmers of that space. And there may be other activities that you do that can bring you into that as well. What I want to end, and then I'll open up for questions and see if anybody on the call has any thoughts or things that they'd like to share. But I want to talk really briefly about the Yamas. So yoga has this kind of moral code of ethics, and there are Yamas and there are Niyamas. Yamas are restraints. They're behaviors and ways that we approach our life. And the Niyamas are observances, kind of things that we're thinking and we're checking in with ourselves on. I'm not going to get into the Niyamas today because the Niyamas, I think, actually take a little bit more discipline. The Yamas are really easy and approachable ways to begin to walk this path of yoga off the mat, right? And there's 5 of them. So the first is non-harming. And when I first started studying yoga, I thought, well, I'm not fighting with anybody, like I'm not physically causing violence, but harm can be inflicted in a lot of ways. And that comes back to ignorance. It comes back even to the stories that we tell ourselves, which can do self-harm, right? How many of us I read a really amazing Instagram post by one of the teachers at Tough Love, I think yesterday, about self-deprecating humor and how she sometimes is self-deprecating to make other people feel comfortable. And that can be kind of cute or cool or whatever, right? But what happens when we're constantly playing that story back to ourselves in our head? So that's the type of harm that we can do that can come from even a really helpful place of like trying to serve the people around us and feeling like we're all in it together when we make a joke about this. But the truth is, we don't need to do that, right? And it's not really serving us or anybody else to do that. So non-harming goes way past just being a vegetarian or vegan, although my hat is off. Those are really noble attitudes or lifestyles to have. But it includes that mental chatter and what's going on in your mind, and also how we talk about other people. You know, if you think about even politics right now, we're perpetuating a lot of negativity, and that energy has to move someplace, right? So, you know, it's an interesting thing to try, and you might leave this call today, and your next step might be to focus for a week on the yama of non-harming and non-violence, and see if you can catch yourself without judgment. There's going to be no judgment if you don't feel like you do a great job at it at first. It takes a while. The second yama is satya, or truthfulness. And again, most of us are going to say, well, I'm not a liar, you know, purposefully. I think most of us tell little white lies from time to time. Sometimes the lies can be a protection or trying not to hurt somebody's feelings. But in the yoga philosophy, we're trying to let go of that. So, you know, this has come up in our teacher training where people will say, well, what if you know something about your friend's spouse and you want to tell your friend, or your friend asks you, you don't want to lie, but you don't want to get involved in it. It gets really challenging, right? In yoga, there's an idea that there's 4 types of actions. There's actions that do more good than harm. And so the thought would be, okay, well, I'm going to tell her that's going to do some harm. I'm going to pull myself into the situation. It may end up backfiring, because that sometimes happens. And you become, you know, the person both of them are angry at. But ultimately, maybe it does more good than harm, and I'm going to take one for the team. There are actions that do more harm than good, which we're typically trying to avoid just because we've probably been brought up that way. There are actions that do a little bit of harm and a little bit of good. And then there's actions that do no harm and no good. And they kind of leave everything as is. And ultimately in yoga, the thought is to move more in that direction where we're not impacting the world around us. We're not impacting the people around us. However, that is a progression over time, right? Because we also look at social issues, and there's going to be a responsibility there. So it's a balance. And when it comes to truthfulness specifically, I think a lot of times we have to step back and look at actions in that way. The other place that truthfulness can come in is in regard to the stories that you tell yourself. It's very easy to re-ingrain these narratives in our head, but every so often, we need to practice self-study and look at our own behaviors and really assess and understand how we are contributing to a situation. So that can be a big one, and it might speak to you and be where you're at right now in life. The next yama is non-stealing, and that sounds very simple as well, right? One of the biggest ones that comes up specifically in yoga teacher training, we have had this happen a couple of times, and nobody is ever happy when they get called on it. Non-stealing, we think of financial gain, right? But we all probably have a friend, and we may be the friend who energetically is just pulling the life out of another person. I've been in relationships, romantic relationships, where I probably did that to somebody in the past. Hopefully no more. Hopefully I learn, right? But we've all have probably either experienced that or done that. that can be a big one. Like going in and just overwhelming a group of people can be a difficult thing for you and for the people around you. And the second way, really common, that non-stealing shows up is being consistently late. Now that I have a business, I have to tell you, this is a really hard one for me. And my lateness comes from wanting to get more done, but it's lateness nonetheless. Like, it's not showing up for the responsibilities around us. And ultimately that affects everything else in our life, right? So it's a really simple idea of not taking what doesn't belong to you, whether it's money, somebody's husband, attention, time. But it can be really difficult when you take a fine eye to your life. When we clean that up, the universe opens up for us. So it's worth the discipline that it takes. The next yama is maintaining vitality, which has often been summarized as abstinence or abstaining from sexual activity. The reason why is because sex is thought of as a sharing or a giving of your energy body, right? So physically, yes, you're sharing your body, but energetically, you are merging with another person, right? And we do that all day long, whether it is between the sheets or, between your cubicle walls, like you are interacting with people. And there is an idea of really becoming protective of our own energy and choosing mindfully who we are going to share that with, whether it's a lover or another person. So this might be you. This was me when I first left my corporate job and I started working for myself. I was scared shitless that I wasn't going to have enough money to stand on my own 2 feet. So I started saying yes to everything. I will teach that kids class. I will teach that private yoga thing. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to do this class. And before I knew it, I was completely exhausted. Our energy is a currency, and it's valuable, and it's incredibly easy to give it away, whether it's through work or gossip or obsessive thought or chatter in the mind. The yoga yamas ask us to be more mindful of where our energy is going and to begin to guard it and treat it like a precious, precious currency, because it is finite. There's only so much of it, right? And then the last yama is non-possessiveness. Ooh, that's a big one. That means like, okay, we're not going to be jealous of the people around us. We're not going to be envious of somebody else's success. We are not in our romantic relationships going to overpower or force somebody to make us their life. I don't know how many of you know Nipsey Hussle, who recently passed away. He's a West Coast rapper out in LA, and he was really admired and is really admired by a lot of people. And he has had, I don't know if they were married, him and Lauren, or if they were just like a long-term couple with a child, but she talked about their relationship when he passed. And she said, you taught me to not want to possess in a relationship, and instead of possessing, to experience you as a human being. And I thought that was really beautiful, because a lot of times in relationships we can get very possessive. It's like we want to do this, that, and the other with the person. And in the effort of doing that, we lose the entire experience. We see this when we go to concerts and people are up with their cell phones. It's like, I want to possess, I want to own this video of you performing, but I don't want to actually be there and have that experience, right? And so possessiveness can weave in so many different unexpected areas. When we're working with these yamas, I always advise people to choose one that you feel like really speaks to you, and to take a week and notice how that plays out in your life, and then reassess and see how behaviors can be changed and shifted, and work with it again for another week, and then again for another week. Give yourself time versus trying to bite off everything, because as adults, we become really habitual and our habits begin to overpower even our morals and our spirituality many times. So it takes a while to undo. And when you notice that you're going down the wrong path, try not to judge. That will happen. We're all human beings. And if I'm 40 this year, so it's been 40 years of pulling me out of my true essence. It's probably going to take 40 more to get me back. And then I'll be a really rad 80-year-old, I hope, one day, right? So that's the path for now. And if you want to work with it and you have personal questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to private message you on Instagram. I'm happy to talk to you before or after classes. I'm happy you can shoot me an email. You guys know how to find me, I think. I want to take a moment and just